Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Sunday. So today, now that the weather is nice and sunny outside, at least here in Shreveport, we're going to have an uplifting discussion about death. So from some of our previous conversations, our stance on life is that we only have this life. It's the only thing that we know about, the only thing we can prove, at least to ourselves, that we can have. And so this week I celebrated a birthday. I'm now 1 year older by the calendar. And that caused me to think about life. So I also have my mother visiting in town. And we were having a discussion yesterday about how I was thinking from her position, how it must be interesting to watch me as her child have children. Because in her mind, most of the time we were together in the same space, I was a child. So in her mind, her vision of me is more likely to focus on, my being a child. So it's kind of like an interesting thing to think about, your children having children. And so that got me thinking about, what do we accomplish in our lives? And then from the humanist perspective, what about death? So I know some of our people who follow us on Facebook or who are associated with us have experienced some deaths in their families recently. And one of the big features, I think, of traditional religion is they gave people an answer for, why people die or what happens when people die. So what do we have as humanists? And so I thought it would be an interesting thing to consider today. So life, death, and the fear of death, and then what it all means and what meaning we can give to it. So like I said, religion's always been about answering the big questions. And so throughout history, philosophers have always tried to describe or explain why things happen. And they did it with whatever information they had available at the time. The science available, the mysticism available, the dogma available at the time. And so they provided those explanations grounded in whatever their culture happened to be. So some of those explanations then grew into systems, right, and became religion, right? So something that was organized and structured and followed by many people. And then notionally, religions tried to help people better understand their circumstances, right? Better cope with what was around them and what they were dealing with. Eventually, of course, those systems grew to wield enormous power. And then they created dogma and required, sometimes by force, their followers to adhere to those bits of dogma and rules. Now, some might argue that those religions provide a simplified way for people to process life, right? It provides a checklist that basically says, as long as you do these things, you're in good company, and that you'll be, saved in the afterlife. And so you can deal with your suffering kind of by compartmentalizing it to this life. And that you'll be okay in the afterlife, or your family is okay in the afterlife, or whatever it happens to be. So it is a way to cope with what we see and experience in our lives. So I think from the humanist perspective, we take into account the advances in science and philosophy since the beginning of humanity. And therefore, to us, it seems as though we should have a slightly more flexible framework through which to consider the world, right? Science has given additional explanation or replaced mystical explanation for the things that we experience in the world, whether it was the movement of the planets or what the stars are made of, or whether the earth is flat or round, right? So science has continued to expand our understanding of our existence. And so we should incorporate that as humans, right? Even if you go back to using the Bible as a starting point, right? God gave humans free will and rational thought, right? So I saw a meme this week, basically, that said, and I forget exactly who it was that was quoted, but that it is not that ancient humans wrote the stories in the Bible and whatever it was literally, and that we are now smart enough to take them figuratively. It's that humans back then wrote those stories figuratively, and now we have lost the intelligence to consider things figuratively. That's kind of the summarized bit of that. And so I think that's important that we now, today, whether you adhere to traditional religion or don't, I think it's important that we re-examine some of our fundamental assumptions, particularly about life and death, because that is really where it all begins and ends. So one of the things about death is our fear of it, right? From a humanist perspective, right? When you die, depending on how you process it, when you die, you're done. Your experience is over. So there's nothing to fear. It's just an absence, right? For some, that might even be a lack of pain, right? People who are living in pain or suffering. So they might consider it a positive thing versus a negative thing. But we're afraid of it because it's unknown, right? The unknown has always been our greatest fear. Known threats are much easier to process. There was a great documentary about the brain. I think you can find it on Netflix. Is it Brain Games? I think it's Brain Games. And one of their episodes dealt with fear. And they took 3 people and they were going to bring them basically through like a house of horrors, and they explained to them the things they were going to experience, spiders and snakes and whatever else. And so they basically strapped them to a sensory deprivation chair where they couldn't see, they couldn't hear, they could only feel. And they put them in a room by themselves just for a period of time. And some people didn't even make it in the room. Their imagination of the unknown was so overwhelming that they didn't even make it.
I wouldn't call that unknown.
But they don't know exactly what the threats are, right?
They couldn't see it though.
So it's still unknown though. So then other people made it a bit farther, right? And lasted a bit longer, and then one made it all the way through basically because he just froze in place. But our fear of the unknown is incredibly powerful. And so we come up with stories to help us better understand whatever it is that we think might be in the unknown.
But it is Brain Games, and it is on Netflix.
Okay, so it is Brain Games on Netflix. I have my research assistant here. So people have come up with stories to help explain what happens after. So some of those stories is, reincarnation, the afterlife, and those are ways to cope with the unknown. So from a humanist perspective, so those are kind of the mystical ways, right? But if we translate those into maybe a humanist perspective, the way that we see it, and we talked about this a bit last time, is not simply that you exist and then you die and then it's as if you'd never existed, right? Your story is carried on through your interaction with the rest of humanity. So one way to think about that, even from a physics perspective, is energy transmission. And we talked about this in terms of investing in education and complexity last week. If we're investing in each other, helping to educate each other, investing in the complexity of humanity, then you've transmitted energy from you to the next person. And right, energy is neither created or destroyed, it's simply transferred. And so you live on even from the physical perspective, so you could call that karma, you could call that a sense of reincarnation in that you live on through others. And not in the mystical sense that there's a piece of your soul necessarily, but there is energy that you pass on. Whether it's through loving your children or teaching somebody something, a skill, or by creating something that then helps humanity, right? That's how we continue our story. So there are societies that have this idea that you die twice. So if you've seen the movie Coco, a Disney movie, right? Good movie. I'd recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's a tearjerker. So in this movie, and in some societies, so when you die, you pass from the physical realm into the spiritual realm. But as long as your family and your friends remember you, right, and usually on the Day of the Dead, you remember your family members and you cherish them and talk about what they did in their lives and how they were, then you continue on sort of in that spiritual sense. Now, even from the humanist perspective, that's not necessarily a bad model to look at. If we talk about our relatives, right, and we talk about what they taught us, and we focus on how they contributed to our lives, but if we can maintain reality, right, so not everybody's perfect. In fact, I'd wager that very few of us are. And we look at them and say, they had flaws, but they also gave me something. and that we appreciate both of those things because they taught us lessons. Right? And over time, of course, our stories become truncated, right? We continue to summarize them to be shorter and shorter. And eventually they fade away, or at least they fade around kind of into the background energy of humanity continuing forward. But I think that's an interesting concept to consider as we consider human life. Because it isn't just about what I can cram into my finite life, right? This is where we get back to finite and infinite games. It's about how do I contribute to the whole of humanity to keep it going on infinitely into the future? How do I transmit my energy to make it more resilient and more complex over the longest term? Now, when it comes to death, again, so in the humanist perspective, nothing has inherent meaning. There is no greater purpose per se ascribed to us from an external source. Right? I think most of us hold that there is necessarily no God's will, no interventionist deity directing things in our lives. So that can make it very hard to cope with the death of a child, the death of a loved one, because it doesn't necessarily mean anything unless we ascribe meaning to it. One of our previous services talked about suffering, how suffering and discomfort is necessary for human growth. Now, when bad things happen, or things that cause us distress happen, I personally think we have two choices. We can dwell upon how much the suffering and distress hurts on the negative piece of it, or we can look to ascribe meaning to it and therefore take action on it. Eric, I think you posted a meme earlier today that when something bad happens, we have two choices. And in your meme, it said thoughts and prayers, and then all the other buttons on this master control board would do something. Now, I would translate that to say we can either dwell on the suffering or we can do something. And the do something means, all right, I'm going to take some lesson from this, and then I'm going to do something about it. Let's say a child dies, and let's say it's from a disease or an illness. What do we do about that? You know, we can dwell upon why did this happen and why me, or we can say, this happened. And what I'm going to do about it is I'm going to use my anguish and use what I've experienced to help convey to others the importance of medical research, for example. And it becomes a purpose for you. You make that suffering meaningful by taking action. I think if we do this, we can overcome some of the fear of death, right? Again, humans are programmed to fear the unknown. It's a survival technique from the evolutionary sense. But if we can take a little bit of that fear away, we can control it and use it for humanity's advancement. So I think that's important to consider about death and the fear of death. So now I want to get into, all right, so what about life? So we've talked about death. That's what happens at the end. It's how we can cope with the deaths of others. It's how we can continue to advance in our own lives. But what about human life in general? What about humanity as it goes forward? So I want to get a little bit philosophical and talk about a couple of wagers out there. So there's Pascal's wager, right? Some of you may be familiar with Pascal's wager. And I'll give a quick summary. And this is one interpretation, and there are actually more than one interpretations of Pascal's wager based on his writing as a whole, and then other parts of that whole treatise, basically, that he wrote. But this is just one. It basically argues, and I got this from Wikipedia, by the way, but I've also read the actual Pascal's wager. I just thought it was a good summary. It argues that a rational person should live as though God exists and seek to believe in God. If God does not actually exist, such a person will only have a finite loss, some pleasures and luxury in life, whereas the person stands to receive infinite gains as represented by eternity in heaven and avoid infinite losses in eternity in hell, right? So Pascal's wager basically says that there is either an afterlife or there is not, based on a very particular description of an interventionist God that basically said there is or is not an afterlife. And so what it is saying is that if you go through life and restrict yourself so as to live a good life, or at least live by the rules of this God, then you get into the afterlife. So you experience some finite loss in your life, but infinite gain in the afterlife. Or you could, and it seems as though he's focused on a particularly kind of hedonistic life in the human life, live that way and then have infinite loss and eternity in hell. That assumes some fundamental pieces about humanity, right? That there is an afterlife, right? That there is an interventionist God, or a God at least that has prescribed certain rules. So what I'd like to offer is a different wager. So I'd call this humanity's wager. And I would say that humanity's wager is, since we're bounded by this existence, right? We can't prove or disprove anything outside of this existence. It's much like trying to disprove something before the Big Bang. Right? We cannot reach it, at least as of yet, so as to know what could have been or what should be. So therefore, it's impossible to, at the afterlife anyways, an impossible promise on which to base human decisions. So I don't make any assertions that there is or is not an afterlife because I don't think it's provable. But I think it's impossible to base our decisions on such a promise. Therefore, here are the wagers, and there are four, much as there are in Pascal's. That, and it actually has nothing to do with the afterlife. It has everything to do with our presence here on earth and in existence. So 1, an interventionist God exists and will maintain the earth for humanity's future. And that's basically infinite gain. An interventionist God exists, but will not maintain earth for the future of humanity. Infinite loss. An interventionist God does not exist, and we run out of resources before we leave this planet and expand into the universe. Again, infinite loss. Or an interventionist God does not exist, and we marshal our resources to leave the planet and expand throughout the universe. Infinite gain. So with the first two of those, logic would show that you can't prove or disprove the existence of God, the whole concept of God, let alone a particularly interventionist God that is either going to maintain or not maintain the earth. Right? And the Bible is actually conflicted about this. Right? So the Bible on one hand says that earth is God's creation and it is for humanity to tend, or basically that God is all-powerful and will take care of humanity and the earth. So my position as a humanist, I don't assert or deny the existence of God because I don't think it's provable, and I don't think it's particularly relevant. But I would say that because we can't sense that, we should probably not base our decisions on the future of humanity on an interventionist God, and should instead look to the final two of the wagers. We either marshal our resources to get off the planet or we don't. To me, the choice seems pretty clear, that we should marshal our resources to figure out how to get off this planet. Now, that doesn't mean that we should immediately escape and burn the planet to a cinder, right? We have to maintain the resources today to allow us the time to develop the technology to survive off of this planet. Now, that's a really, really long-term vision, right? We've been off the planet for very short periods of time. But I think if we expand our timeline long enough, if we try and look as far as we can into the infinite game, we realize that at least to me, it appears as though that's an inevitability. That we will have to diversify to avoid catastrophes such as asteroids, or even in the very longest term, the sun burning out. And I understand it seems hard when we're politically divided and we're fighting over the resources of today to think that far out. But as we talked about last week, I don't think that the resources we have today are as scarce as they are presented to us. I think we have enough resources to provide for people so that we could focus on these long-term problems and solutions. Now, I've not written a whole dissertation on this particular wager. It's just something that I thought of as basically a thought experiment, a way to consider our engagement in the world. So it's not the right answer, as nothing that we present ever is. It is simply a way to look at the world. So it asks you to consider that as you go forward. And as we think about life and death, going back to the original topic, I think this framework is useful for us to consider, how are we going to use our lives? How are we going to propagate our energy forward to maintain the complexity necessary to support human life, whether on this planet or on others? How do we live on through our efforts and through the efforts of our children and our grandchildren as they move forward into time? So to me, the wager should be that we act as if there is no interventionist force maintaining this earth. And that's, again, regardless of what anyone believes. And so what I want to leave you with is a quote. It's by Pascal. By space the universe encompasses and swallows me up like an atom. By thought I comprehend the world. So in the infinite, or as far as we know, the vast universe, we are very small. But through our thought, and particularly through our collective thought as humanity, we can better understand our place in the universe and how we can advance the human story. So thank you very much for being with us this week. I appreciate the reflection on a topic that is considered to be gloomy, but I think instead could be a motivator for us if we use it to our advantage. So with that, we'll close the video for the week. I would challenge you at home to, again, reflect on what you were grateful for from the week and what you're thankful for in the week to come. And we will see you all next week. Thank you very much.